The Hourglass and the Arcade by C.T. Stewart. At precisely 3:03 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday, Beth Carmichael, 14, exhausted by homework and hormones, stood under the yellowish glow of a single street lamp near the arcade. Her 12-year-old sister Jade hopped from foot to foot beside her, squeezing a Rubik's Cube as though it might slip away in the drizzle. The neon sign above them buzzed as flickering Galactic Arcade and Lanes letters glowed brightly. Inside, the familiar pulse of synth music and the tinny clang of pinball beckoned. "I'm telling you, Beth," Jade pleaded. "I am fine. I'll be home by dinner." Ever since their dad died 9 months ago, Jade had been different. Their entire family had been different. But in the last few months, something had changed. Jade had begun retreating into the swirling lights of the arcade every spare chance she could. At first, Beth assumed it was just Jade's way of coping. Their father had often played games there for hours on end. But Beth had recently realized that something was off. Jade seemed obsessed. As the months had passed, Beth occasionally tried to pry information out of Jade's friends. But it seemed even they were oblivious. All they knew was what Beth knew. Jade would sneak away any chance she could, even during lunch break at school, often missing her afternoon classes, to go down to the arcade and play the same game her dad used to play, Hourglass. That was particularly odd because the game had seemingly stopped working around the same time her father had passed. Its screen was faintly cracked, and the marquee lights flickered as though they might die at any moment. Beth, shivering in the cold autumn drizzle, decided to confront her. "Why do you keep playing that broken thing?" Jade shrugged, her eyes evading her sister's. She quietly mumbled, "It's not as broken as people think," and quickly stepped into the arcade. Jade missed dinner that night. Hours later, Beth heard her quietly return to her bedroom. Beth pushed open Jade's bedroom door with more force than she intended. Jade looked up in surprise. She was perched on her bed, still in her denim jacket and half-soaked sneakers hanging over the edge, hugging the faded Rubik's Cube to her chest. A faint hum from Beth's radio, left on low, emitted the unmistakable steady beat and light drums, characteristic of soft rock. "You missed dinner," Beth said flatly, trying and failing to keep the anger out of her voice. "Mom was worried. I was worried." Jade flinched. I lost track of time." Beth shoved the door fully closed, muffling the music. "You've been losing track of time every other night these days. You can't keep disappearing." Jade set the Rubik's Cube down on a pillow. Her eyes dotted across the floor, avoiding her sister's. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Beth's frustration flared. "You can't just say, 'I'm sorry,' and act like everything's normal, Jade. Where were you?" At that, Jade's lips trembled. She ran a hand through her rain-damp hair, then finally met Beth's gaze. "Hourglass," she said. "The arcade game." Beth blew out a breath, forcing her shoulders to relax. "I guess that much. But why do you keep going back to that broken ancient thing? It's—" She bit her lip. "Look, I don't want you to think I'm being cruel, but it's not normal. I can't keep it from you anymore," Jade croaked, voice trembling with sorrow and urgency. Beth's stomach twisted. "Keep what from me?" She imagined the worst. Maybe Jade was in trouble, or the school was threatening suspension for all her missed classes. Jade swallowed, pressing her eyes shut. "Dad, he's in the game." For a moment, Beth just stared. "Jade, that's not funny." Her voice again came out harsher than she intended, fueled by fear for her sister's well-being. "I'm not kidding," Jade insisted. Her fingers curled around the edges of her Rubik's Cube, as though clinging to a life raft. "When I play Hourglass, I see him sometimes. It's like a glitchy replay of the night he got his last high score. I see him like I am in the room with him, like I could touch him. Sometimes I hear him laugh, Beth." She blinked rapidly, tears welling again. "It's like he's still in there, waiting to be released." Beth's skin crawled with goosebumps, and her chest felt tight, panic surging at the thought of Jade slipping into some delusion. She forced herself to keep calm. "I'm worried about you," she whispered. "You're grieving. You need help. Not this." Jade's tears fell freely, but she remained defiant. "I know what I saw, Beth. I know how crazy it sounds, but it's real to me." Beth's heart pounded. Part of her wanted to shake her sister, demand she snap out of it. Another part wanted to burst into tears alongside Jade. Taking a step closer, she lowered herself onto the bed, the old springs creaking. "Jade," Beth whispered, "you're scaring me. I miss him too, every day. But this is going too far." Jade looked away. "I don't expect you to believe me. Just let me figure things out, okay?" Beth could only stare at the vulnerability etched on Jade's face, fighting the ache in her own chest. She reached out to gently squeeze her sister's hand. A few restless days passed after that tense bedroom conversation. Beth caught Jade slipping out during school lunch breaks, weaving excuses about study hall, returning home after sundown with that vacant, distant look in her eyes. Each time, Jade seemed to disappear into the arcade longer than the day before. Finally, Beth had a plan she decided was brilliant. Maybe if she took Jade to the arcade to have some fun, she could replace Jade's last memories of Dad with something healthier. She would help Jade have a new reference point grounded in the here and now. That night, she dropped into the living room where Jade was fiddling with her Rubik's Cube. The neon glow of their old floor lamp cast distorted shapes on the wall, a muted reflection of the swirling lights Beth knew awaited them at the galactic arcade and lanes. "Hey," Beth said, trying for casual. "You feel like going to the arcade tonight? My treat. Maybe we can have some fun, just us together?" Jade blinked, clearly taken aback. "What?" she murmured, losing her grip on the Rubik's Cube. Beth forced a gentle smile. "Yeah, pizza slices, a few rounds of Pac-Man. We don't have to stay long." A flicker of hesitation crossed Jade's face, but she shrugged. "Sure, okay, I guess." They arrived just an hour before closing time, neon signs vivid in the night. When the door swung open, a blast of artificially cold air hit them, carrying the familiar beeps and trills of a Tron arcade game near the entrance. Sticky floors shimmered under the flickering overheads. A couple of older kids in faded denim jackets huddled around Gauntlet, while the snack bar served up lukewarm cola under a gaudy New Wave diner banner. "Race you to Pac-Man," Beth said, making sure her tone sounded playful, not tense. Jade grabbed Beth's wrist. "Fine, but I'm taking your high score down." The sisters sidled over to the row of classic machines, Pac-Man, Galaga, Miss Pac-Man, all humming with distinctive charm. Near the soda dispenser that always gave suspiciously flat cola, they slipped quarters into Pac-Man, and for a few precious minutes, they were just two kids battling for supremacy on a pixelated maze, laughing as Jade teased Beth, Jade being far superior at the game than her older sister. It didn't take long before Beth could sense Jade's attention drifting toward the arcade's far corner, where a half-dead marquee spelled Hourglass in sputtering neon. Finally, Jade couldn't resist. She abandoned Pac-Man mid-level and wandered away. Beth's stomach tightened. Here we go again, she thought. She apologized to a kid who had been waiting for the machine, then followed Jade. The battered hourglass cabinet was dim except for a rhythmic static flicker across its cracked screen. A faint hum vibrated the floor. The floor was tacky underfoot. Somebody must have spilled an entire soda earlier. But Jade didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were locked on the battered hourglass machine in the corner, where the sputtering neon marquee cast a flickering light across the otherwise dim section of the arcade. Suddenly, Milo ambled over. He was a classmate with spiky hair and a penchant for pizza, evident by the flecks of sauce dotting his white t-shirt. He raised an eyebrow at Jade. "Yo, Jade, still at that busted thing?" he asked, gesturing toward Hourglass. "I swear every time somebody tries it, the screen wigs out like something out of a bad sci-fi flick." Jade offered a vague shrug. "I'm studying it." Milo snorted. "Studying? Okay, Ms. Science Fair." But before he could press further, a new wave track from the nearby jukebox kicked in, luring him away as Milo grinned. "You two are weird," he teased over his shoulder. Then he was gone, weaving back into the crowd. Beth watched Milo leave and turned back to Jade, who was already sliding a quarter into the hourglass coin slot. The cabinet rattled with a hollow clunk, swallowing the coin. An odd hiss of static rippled around the edges of the cracked screen, making Beth's arm hair stand on end. Jade pressed start. Instantly, jagged, randomly colored lines jittered across the display. Instead of the usual star field or countdown sequence, a very deep, resonant hum crept out of the speakers. A few curious kids peeked over, then scoffed and went back to their own games once they saw the glitchy mess. But Beth and Jade remained transfixed. Amid the shifting pixels, a vague image of a lonely road materialized. A stretch of blacktop rendered in blocky gray, complete with a station wagon parked to one side. It was an impossible amount of detail for the machine to be able to show. Beth gasped. "That's—" Jade interrupted her. "That's Dad's old car," she whispered, eyes large as quarters. "The wood-paneled station wagon." Beth's heart hammered so loud she was sure Jade could hear it. I'm sure it's just coincidence," she managed. "Or maybe we just never noticed it before." As if in conversation with herself, she continued, exclaiming, "But I've never seen a game with detail like that before." She quieted down as text appeared on the screen. "Load save state, February 19th, blinked at the bottom of the screen in flickering green. Beth's mouth went dry. That was the day before their dad's accident. 9 months ago. Jade looked at her with knowing, before she quietly pressed the red arcade button. The screen erupted in a blinding display of rainbow static. The overhead fluorescence flickered, plunging the arcade into half-shadow, though no one around them seemed to notice. The machine's hum crescendoed into a roar. "Jade!" Beth tried to yank her sister away, but it felt like invisible hands were pulling them in. Then, pop! Like a bubble bursting, the noise and chaos vanished. Beth blinked hard. They stood in the same arcade, only now it was slightly different. The walls were freshly painted, the posters crisp, and some of the newly installed arcade machines were gone. Beth's voice shook. "Where are we?" Jade pointed, and Beth followed her gaze to a man in a familiar brown jacket at the end of the row of gaming machines. In the opposite corner, near the snack counter, stood a man in a familiar brown jacket with big shoulders, the same one Dad always wore. His short hair was tidy and unmistakably familiar. He was playing Gauntlet, one of Dad's favorites. "Dad?" Beth managed, her voice catching. He was alive, laughing with someone, maybe a friend they didn't recognize. The friend walked away, leaving Dad alone. Beth could hear a mechanical voice from the game her father was playing. "Treasure, 100 points," indicating a new game had just been started. For a moment, Beth could only stare, tears burning her eyes. She took a step forward, but stumbled into a table. A full glass of soda tipped and crashed onto the floor with a splash. Onlookers turned, startled by the commotion, including her father. His smile vanished. He stared at them, confusion flickering in his eyes. Beth opened her mouth to call his name, but then the overhead lights surged again. The arcade began to dissolve into static. Another wave of that magnetic force seized them. Beth felt a tug behind her eyes, like her brain was being pulled through a straw. She let out a startled gasp, saw Jade's face contort, and then darkness. It took a few moments for Beth and Jade's vision to clear, but they were back in the dim arcade. The neon sign outside was switched off, and the closed sign hung on the door. A single overhead light buzzed ominously. Beth's heart pounded so hard, she thought her ribs might crack. A rough, angry voice cut through the hush. "Hey, you two!" The arcade's manager, a stocky man with thinning hair, stormed over, keys rattling in his fist. "We closed half an hour ago. Were you hiding in here?" Beth looked around. Everything felt disorienting. Had it really been that long? Jade's hands were trembling, her breathing ragged. We didn't realize," Beth managed. Never mind your excuses," the manager barked, waving a flashlight. "Out, now!" He began ushering them, practically shoving them toward the exit. "You're lucky I don't call your parents or the cops. Teenage delinquents." Beth wanted to protest, but couldn't form the words. Her head still reeled with the impossible image of their father. Jade clutched Beth's sleeve, and they stumbled out the front door, half expecting the manager to follow them with more threats. But he merely locked up and glared at them through the glass until they left. They rode home in silence, pedaling their BMX bikes through deserted streets lit only by the occasional lamppost. They quietly slipped back into their home, and without a word, both went into Beth's bedroom and shut the door. Jade dropped her Rubik's Cube onto a faded Care Bear's nightstand, fiddling anxiously with one of its colored stickers. Beth stared out her window for a long while. Eventually, both wordlessly sat down on the floor together. Beth's room reflected her passions. There were more than one Michael Jackson and Pat Benatar posters, while a single Tron movie poster hung crooked above the dresser. In the corner, a pin-up of Cyndi Lauper stared at them in silent camaraderie. "I knocked over that soda," Beth whispered at last, eyes still damp. "And everyone looked, including Dad. I think he saw us, Jade. He actually saw us." Jade exhaled shakily. He was right there, smiling, laughing, like he was just a minute away from heading out, so alive. Her voice hitched. "That was real." Beth cried deeply for several moments before quietly saying, "I am sorry. I didn't believe you. You were right." Jade nodded without saying a word. Beth's heart thrummed as she replayed the scene. It didn't feel like a dream or a hallucination. It felt like we really went back. Her throat constricted, memories of that awful morning surging up. She stared at the Tron poster, at the neon lines and futuristic city. "You think we can actually change it? Stop him from ever getting in that car?" Jade's face looked confused for a moment as she slowly comprehended what her sister was saying. She had never considered that she might actually be visiting the past, and therefore might be able to change its events. "I hadn't even thought of that," she said quietly. After a long pause, she all but shouted, "We owe it to him to try!" Beth pressed her face into her hands, torn between a dizzy thrill and abject terror. But after a breath, she reached for Jade's hand. "Then we do it together," she said, voice trembling but certain. "We'll go back. We'll try to save Dad." Beth was resolute in her heart. If they could walk the past once, they could do it again. The next day, Beth and Jade huddled in Beth's bedroom after school. The door shut tight against the noise of the house. Beth's radio was only half tuned to the right station, but neither sister seemed to notice. Jade sat cross-legged on the floor, scribbling in a spiral notebook. Beth hovered over her shoulder, knees pressed awkwardly into the worn carpet. "Read it back to me," Beth whispered. Jade ran a shaky hand through her hair, clearing her throat. "I put it in all caps to make it sound serious enough. Do not drive tomorrow morning. You will die. Please trust us." She paused, looking up, eyes haunted. "Is that enough?" Beth swallowed hard. "We can't give away too much. Just enough to make him think twice." Jade nodded. She tore the page out, folding the note into a neat square. "So we slip this into his car the next time we get pulled in. He'll find it. He won't drive. That means—" Her voice trembled with hope. "He lives." Beth's stomach twisted with a mix of excitement and dread. "We have to be careful. We have no idea how this time travel thing works. Just in and out as quick as we can." Jade just pressed the note to her chest, eyes full of desperate longing. "We have to try." That evening, after their mother had dozed off from another late shift at the diner, the sisters once again left for the arcade. The suburban street lay silent, a faint glow of streetlights reflecting off wet pavement. They pedaled their BMX bikes through the hush, hearts pounding in anticipation. Once inside the arcade, Hourglass still flickered with that eerie neon sputter. The quarter Jade fed into the slot clunked heavily, as if the machine were devouring it. She took a shaky breath and reached for the start button. A flash of glitchy shapes lit up the screen once more, before turning into their father's station wagon. Then the hum, the surge of static, and that sudden pull that felt like hands yanking them through a tunnel. Pop! They found themselves once again in the past version of galactic arcade and lanes. Their father stood in the same place in the corner, playing Gauntlet, just like before. Beth sucked in a breath. He's here. Jade wordlessly moved towards the arcade door as quickly as she could. Her hands shook with dread. She pushed through the arcade doors and out into the lot. The air felt warmer in February than it did in November. The grass looked greener with the oncoming spring. Jade darted to the front of the station wagon, the note clutched tight. She tried the door with no luck. Dad had always locked the car. The next best thing she could figure out was to put it under a windshield wiper. She returned to the arcade entrance and noticed Beth still standing where she was before, just gaping at their father. Jade remembered being the same way the first many times she had come here and smiled. No sooner had she set foot back in the arcade lights began to flicker. A wave of static distortion crackled at the edges of her vision as that terrible pull yanked her back to reality. The world tore away in a swirl of neon and static. She felt both her feet leave the ground, as though gravity itself had dissolved. Then, that familiar gut-churning pop. As they re-entered the familiar arcade, with no one around them seemingly the wiser, Jade clung to Beth's arm, knees nearly buckling. "We did it," she gasped. "He has the note." "You did it," said Beth with a certain pride in her voice. The girls raced out of the arcade toward their home, breathless and half-delirious, bolstered by the wild hope that, by leaving the note for their father, they'd somehow undone his fatal accident. Adrenaline raced through their veins. Every pump of their BMX pedals felt triumphant, every streetlight illuminating the way toward the life they imagined would be waiting. But as they reached their driveway, heartbeats thundering in anticipation, the house was quiet, unchanged. The battered station wagon was nowhere to be seen. Only their mom's rusted sedan glinted in the pale morning light. No father stepping out to greet them with a laugh, no warm presence bounding from the front door. They slipped inside, trying not to wake their mother. Jade stood in the foyer, arms wrapped around herself, eyes darting wildly as if expecting Dad to appear any second. Beth called his name softly, even though she knew she shouldn't. Silence swallowed each syllable. Her chest tightened, a sharp sting of betrayal. "It's all the same," Jade whispered, voice cracking. "He's still gone." Beth felt tears blur her vision. She had allowed herself one shining moment of belief, one reckless fantasy that maybe, just maybe, he would be at the kitchen table, sipping coffee like he used to. But the table remained bare, except for unopened mail. There was no trace of their father's life restored. Exhausted and heartsick, the sisters crept upstairs. Beth collapsed onto her bed, hugging a throw pillow damp with tears. Jade huddled near the window in her bedroom, staring out at the rising sun with an expression that teetered between despair and fury. Neither slept. Guilt and longing gnawed at them both throughout the night. A couple of days later, Jade excitedly approached Beth after school and practically dragged her to a quiet back corner of the city library, where a battered microfiche machine occupied a desk that nobody ever seemed to use. The librarian gave them a polite nod, thinking they were there for a school project. "I found something," Jade said tersely, feeding old newspaper strips into the microfiche's projector. The machine whirred to life, illuminating the girls' tired faces with ghostly white light. "Check the date." The fuzzy grayscale text slowly focused into view. "Local family in fatal collision." Beth swallowed hard. Her pulse pounded with a kind of sick dread. She knew this headline all too well. She had lived it. "Keep going," Beth whispered, voice barely above a breath. Jade fast-forwarded. "Okay, here." A photograph of their father stared back at them in smeared black and white. A pang of sorrow knifed through Beth's chest. Even on film, his eyes held that gentle spark she'd grown up seeing every morning. "But look at this," Jade's shaky finger pointing. They mention a note found at the scene, something Dad had crumpled in his hand. Beth's breathing hitched. "A note?" Jade swallowed, scanning the text, then read aloud. "Authorities say a cryptic note reading, 'Do not drive tomorrow morning. You will die. Please trust us,' was discovered at the crash site. Police had no leads on who wrote it or how he received it, and it was not in his handwriting. Police are searching for suspects, investigating the accident as a possible homicide." Beth's pulse hammered in her ears. "No," she whispered. "He got our note." Jade grimaced, tears welling. "But he died anyway, and now we could be murder suspects if they figure out it was us who wrote it." Staring at the screen, Beth braced a hand on the microfiche machine to keep her balance. It felt as though the floor had been yanked out from under her. "So, even though he read our warning," Beth said, voice trembling, "he didn't heed it. Or maybe something else forced him onto that road." Her eyes burned with unspent tears. "And now we could be in trouble." Jade's voice cracked, raw with grief. "We couldn't change it. It happened exactly the same." She sank into the wooden chair, burying her face in her hands. "I hate this." Beth placed a reassuring hand on Jade's shoulder, though her own composure threatened to break. "Me too," she murmured. Anger, sorrow, and a suffocating sense of defeat churned within her like a cyclone. Every pulse in her temples reminded her of their fruitless attempts, even as Jade turned in to hug her. As she did, silent tears stained Beth's shirt. "Why does it hurt so much?" Jade whispered. Beth stroked Jade's hair. "Because we loved him." That night, sleep wouldn't come for Beth. She tossed and turned, hearing every creak of the house. At 2:00 a.m., she stumbled out of bed for a glass of water. As she began back up the stairs to her bedroom, the wind outside howled, rattling the windows. She felt a sudden, indescribable chill, as though something was peering in from the darkness. She glanced up through the living room windows, and it seemed as though a shadowy figure was staring at her. She blinked her eyes, and it seemed to be gone. She stood stone-cold still for several minutes, hearing and seeing nothing, except that the living room lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She decided it must have been a trick of the lights. As Beth climbed the stairs, a shaky whisper cut through the darkness, causing her to jump in fear and nearly stumble backwards down the stairs. "Beth, do you feel like someone's here?" It was Jade's whisper. She was standing quietly in the doorway to her room. Beth moved to take Jade's hand, but before she could respond, Jade stiffened in the darkness and pointed down the hallway. "Beth, do you see that?" Beth's heart skittered. A creeping dread slithered up her spine as she turned to look. She spotted a flicker in the dark corner at the end of the hallway, near the closet, something that shouldn't be there, a shape blacker than the shadows around it. She squeezed Jade's arm. I see it," she managed to squeak out, otherwise paralyzed completely by fear. The shape stretched unnaturally, a formless darkness that seemed to flicker in tandem with the wind outside. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. Beth and Jade remained transfixed, hearts pounding. What was that?" Jade stammered, voice quivering. Beth didn't answer. She couldn't, because a terrible suspicion was forming. Their meddling with time had attracted something else, something that had followed them back. That night, the girls fell asleep in each other's arms, in Beth's bed, with the lights on. Beth jolted awake suddenly, unaware that she had fallen asleep. She noticed her clock said it was 6:32 a.m., just before realizing that Jade was standing at the window, her silhouette lit by another dark and rainy day. She was whispering, seemingly to no one. "Jade?" Beth called softly, stumbling out of bed. Jade turned, tears streaking her face. "Beth, he's outside. Dad's outside." Beth's stomach dropped. She rushed to the window. Sure enough, a figure stood at the edge of the lawn, clad in a brown jacket eerily like their father's. But the face was lost in darkness. Even from the second-story vantage, Beth sensed something wrong. The figure didn't move naturally. It seemed stiff, twisted, unfamiliar. Beth and Jade stared, hearts hammering. Then abruptly, the figure lifted a hand in a ghostly wave, one that resembled their dad's casual salute, but it felt hollow, wrong. "No," Beth breathed. That's not Dad." Jade gripped the sill, knuckles white. "It followed us," she said, voice breaking with dawning horror. "Like some echo of him we dragged back." Down on the lawn, the figure seemed to expand temporarily, somehow becoming larger, before vanishing into the morning gloom. Jade collapsed onto the carpet, sobbing. Beth crouched beside her, tears gathering in her own eyes. Daylight offered no comfort to their Saturday. Exhausted and shaky, the sisters bunkered in Beth's room, ignoring the phone that rang intermittently. Their mother was out working a double shift. The police even left a message on the answering machine wanting to speak to the two girls. In light of what they had seen that morning, that felt like the least of their troubles. Beth finally spoke. "We have to stop with this, Jade. We tried to change the past. Now it's like, maybe we tore a hole, and the only thing we've done is stir up a nightmare." Jade slumped, cradling her Rubik's Cube. "But Dad," she whispered. Beth's voice cracked. "Dad is gone." She forced out the words, tears threatening. "And we can't bring him back. All we're doing is hurting ourselves, and maybe everyone else. Our note didn't even fix anything. Now the police are confused. And that thing, that shadow father in the yard, she shuddered. That's not him. Jade sniffled, nodding slowly, as if understanding for the first time. Then what do we do? Beth drew a large breath, relief and heartbreak colliding. I think it's time we say goodbye. That afternoon, the girls finally dared to leave their home, terrified that the shadowy creature would find them. But they had a plan. Their reasoning was that if the thing could hurt them, there was probably little they could do inside their home that they couldn't do outside their home. So, with the resolve of mythic adventurers on a fabled journey against a hopeless darkness, they set out from their home on their BMX bikes. Galactic Arcade and Lanes was their destination. Jade swallowed as they left their porch. "Come on," she said. "We do this together." The girls entered the arcade and made their way toward Hourglass. This time, Beth didn't hesitate. She shoved a quarter in, slamming the start button. Instantly, the screen came alive, swirling with static. A roar of sound built up in the quiet arcade, so loud it made the loose floor tiles rattle. Beth grabbed Jade's arm to steady herself and to comfort Jade. As reality started to bend, out of the corner of her eye, she saw the shadow father appear in the edges of darkness around the room. He edged closer, pulsing and dissolving into the blinking lights like it was part of the same glitchy code. A burst of light echoed around Beth and Jade, and the sisters were hurled into a half-formed replay of a day they knew all too well. Dad asking the family to come with him, almost giddy. His excitement to surprise them and take them somewhere they never got to. They were there at the kitchen table, the faint hiss of the radio in the background. But something felt warped and wrong. The air smelled burnt, and corners of the scene flickered like a bad VHS tape. The shadow figure loomed behind Dad's image, twisting into a monstrous parody of the man they loved. It glared at them with eyes like empty TV screens, a sizzling static that made Beth's scalp tingle. "You're not him!" Jade cried, voice echoing in the fractured memory. "You're just—" she faltered, tears in her eyes. "Everything we wish we could change." A guttural moan rattled the walls, and the shadow rushed toward Beth in desperation. Beth gasped, stumbling back. Her father's face hovered for a split second inside the darkness, a flicker of warmth behind the corruption. "Dad," Beth choked. "I wish—" "Beth!" Jade shouted. "He's gone!" She met the creature's gaze, fearless and trembling all at once. "All that's left is our regret, and we're letting it feed on us." The shadow reeled, letting out a cacophony of static. Its shape flickered, torn between lunging again at Beth and collapsing under Jade's words. Beth finally whispered with realization, her voice thick with emotion. "We loved Dad, and losing him hurt. We tried to fix it any way we could. But we can't. And we don't need you." Beth sidled to Jade's side, forcing herself to confront the nightmare head-on. "You aren't Dad," she said firmly. "You are just the monster of every what-if and if only that we have held on to. He was light, but you are darkness." Beth looked defiant as she issued her final command. "Go!" The entire arcade trembled. Hourglass screeched with a shrill, digital tone as the swirling memory was sundered free of the sisters' grief that empowered the nightmare. The shadow contorted, battered by their defiance. Pop! 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 Sparks snapped from the machine's neon tubes. A final, tortured wail rippled through the entire space. The dark figure glared at them one last time, an empty reflection of everything they couldn't fix, then detonated into a dazzling burst of static. The vile presence evaporated, leaving behind only the echo of the mechanical labored breathing and flickering hum of Hourglass. Beth stumbled backward, nearly falling onto her head before catching herself at the last moment and slowly standing. Jade stood rooted, tears sliding down her cheeks, breath ragged as if she'd run a marathon. Slowly, Hourglass powered down on its own, the screen's final images dissolving into black. The stale silence weighed on them like a curtain falling after the final act of a play where the hero has died. They were back in the arcade in their own time. Exhausted, the sisters trudged up the stairs to Beth's bedroom, shoes squeaking faintly on the hardwood floors. Beth collapsed onto her beanbag chair, head tilted back against the wall. Jade dropped onto Beth's bed. They laid in silence, breath unsteady from the adrenaline crash. Finally, Beth's gaze drifted to the Tron poster above her dresser. She snorted. Jade followed her line of sight. "What?" "It's nothing," Beth sighed, and the two fell fast asleep. This concludes The Hourglass and the Arcade by C.T. Stewart.